Hi, BookTube. It is Peg, and I am back at the History Shelf with a very special guest today. Today, we are having an author interview with Shannon Bontrager, whose book you've seen on my channel. Hi, Shannon. Is Death at the Edges of Empire, Fallen Soldiers, Cultural Memory, and the Making of an American Nation, 1863 to 1921. I just got tabs throughout the book. I love the book. It was, in my book review, I've mentioned it was it opened up so many different what I call rabbit holes, which I want to go down and explore more about just all the areas you covered in the time areas, the Civil War into the Philippine Wars, and all of that, Shannon. It was just, yeah, you really peeled back the onion and and revealed a lot of areas that I hadn't considered in a certain way that I hadn't looked at before. So first of all, just welcome to the History Shelf, and thanks for making time today.
Well, thanks for having me, Peg. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about it. And thanks for welcoming me to your channel. I don't get to watch every video, but I do watch quite a few, and I really appreciate how you are able to live in both this scholarly and popular world of history. And I think it's great, and I learn a lot from you, and I'm sure all your listeners do too. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, I just, it's a passion, and so whether it takes me to scholarly or popular, I just really enjoy talking about history, and I love just having other people get excited about it. So thanks for what you're doing as well, because you're really doing the hard work digging into those archives. All right, well, you know what, for those who are unfamiliar with the book Death at the Edges of Empire, I just thought we could start off with, can you tell us what your main thesis, what your thesis is about in this book?
That's like the toughest question to ever ask an author, I think.
Is it? Okay.
So let me try to put it as simply as I can. I think my argument is that America is an empire, but Americans think the United States is a republic or a democracy. And there's a tension there that is unspoken and really hard to sort of understand. So I wanted to try to investigate that contradiction. Why do Americans remember the American past through this lens of democracy, when our reality is where we often function, our society often functions like an empire? And so I think an effective way to look at that is to look at the war dead. The war dead symbolize the cost of war. We count the cost not before we go to war sometimes, but afterwards. And this gives us an opportunity to understand the cost of war. And I think the way that we commemorate the war dead also exposes the way that we make this contradiction sort of comes to the surface of the tension between empire and democracy. So that's, I think, the thesis. That's what I'm trying to argue anyway. Mm-hmm. And that's why I chose the topic to study the war dead.
That was a really interesting way into the argument. What made you think that? What brought you to that idea of the war dead is a really good way? I mean, was it just something you noticed over time, rituals that we do, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, this kind of stuff?
There were two kind of personal events that happened around about the same time when I was a kid. I kind of remember when Ronald Reagan and the Reagan movement, they had a difficult task. To be conservative after the Vietnam War was also a contradiction. And Reagan tried to, and I think at the end unsuccessfully, but he tried to navigate that contradiction with the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown, the Vietnam Unknown, okay, which we eventually found out the identity of Michael Blasey when his family had reason to believe, and the Reagan administration itself probably knew who Blasey was, but they went ahead with with the dedication of the unknown. I remember either watching that on TV or watching it on the news when I was a little kid. And I was just struck by that. And I think I was struck by that because around about the same time my grandmother died. She died of breast cancer. And this was right before they really had some decent sort of therapies.
Mm-hmm.
Getting cancer was a death sentence. And
Right.
I remember we were at her home the night that she ended up dying. And I remember going to the funeral, and I say this in the acknowledgments, but my grandparents used to be Amish. And so my grandfather had left and he was shunned. So his family were not supposed to talk to him or really sort of have a relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of his Amish relatives showed up to my grandmother's funeral. I think these two moments, just sort of as I was kind of becoming a teenager almost, just really struck upon me how death is so like intimate and political, and we can learn a lot from how people behave in these moments of just profound meaning, not only on a family level, but on a national level. It's kind of interesting how the family and the nation sort of interact there. So I think that's kind of an early answer to that, but I think that those feelings have always kind of been there for me. And then as I became an academic, I was able to sort of kind of think about those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Put it through a filter.
Yeah.
Right. Academic filter. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's pretty profound, especially, I'm thinking back to just a quick aside, my stepfather passed away a couple of years ago, and he was in the Navy, so he had full honors at his funeral with the 21 gun salute and the flag, and so yeah, it does leave an impact on you.
Well, I'm sorry for your stepfather's loss, but I think too it's kind of interesting that these moments. My mom died about 2 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it was terrible, but it was interesting to me as a learning process, because she knew that I had written this book, but she never got to see it. But the funeral itself was so comforting. I was kind of cynical about it. I was like, oh, I've written this book on death, and I don't really think this is really, but people came up and they would share stories. And I think, and maybe in your case, there was this such a commemoration and a tradition around it. It's kind of interesting and comforting how these moments can help people navigate a difficult moment.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think you touch on that theme, and it kind of runs, throughout the book, the sense of people searching for some comfort in the death of a loved one who is in the military. But I know that that'll come later in a couple of more of my questions about just the people that were, the what you call the citizen critics, the people who are just like, give us back the remains of our loved ones. We want to commemorate them. But let's begin then. Let's just start from the beginning. You set there's a target range on this book from 1863 to 1921. So obviously you take as your departure point the Gettysburg commemoration and Lincoln's address. And again, this is a recurring refrain throughout the book, is the sense of Lincoln's promise. You call it Lincoln's promise. Can you just explain what that is, and how you thought that would pertain to the rest of the book, and how America's future, imperialistic adventures and misadventures would, evolve from?
Yeah, sure. The periodization, I think, is maybe an interesting side note, because it doesn't, 1863 to 1921 is not the normal periodization that this kind of history would fit into. Slightly maybe provocative when we think about memory. 1863, the Gettysburg Address, and 1921 is the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So I've tried to play with that periodization a little bit. And that's allowed me to see Lincoln's Gettysburg Address as a starting point, which I don't know if you had to, but in my high school speech class, we had to memorize this speech. And I don't think I can quite recite it by memory anymore, but it's such an important unofficial kind of document, right? It's not the Declaration, it's not the Constitution, but we revere it almost like those other documents. And when I was writing this as a dissertation, my second reader tried to challenge me a little bit by saying, this Gettysburg Address, it's not really that important. It's really just a pro-war, it's just a war statement, right? Lincoln is saying the war is going badly, and he's trying to rally, he's trying to justify why we need to continue to kill people on the battlefield. Isn't that the case? And I looked at him and said, well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'm not saying that's not the case, but I think there's a meaning here in particularly the end of it, where Lincoln establishes, and this is what I think what Lincoln's promise is. He, for the first time in American history, establishes a tradition of how Americans must remember, particularly in this case, the war dead. And if you read the Gettysburg Address closely, he basically obliges the living. He says it's for us, the living, to remember what they did here. He goes on to say, you know, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but they can never forget what they did here. And it's for us, the living, to take up the cause and to guarantee that there's a new birth of freedom. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And so I've taken that argument to say that Lincoln made a promise to the dead right there on the battlefield. And that promise is a promise that the federal government and the American citizenry together will remember the war dead for the noble cause and the defense of liberty. And it's a citizen's obligation. I think the Gettysburg Address made it an obligation for the citizens to do this in a democracy. We have to remember those who defend it. So that's what I would say is the beginnings of Lincoln's promise, a promise to the dead that Americans, for the most part, throughout its history, has tried to fulfill. We have national cemeteries. Your stepfather, as you pointed out, had basically was a benefactor of Lincoln's promise. This was the American nation and our government commemorating your stepfather's service. And Lincoln, I think, made that promise, and we've continued to sort of uphold it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Do you think that Lincoln at the time, do you think, in my mind, I think, well, he was speaking just about that war, the Civil War, right? Do you think he had that? Was he thinking further forward, or was it just like, this is our duties as citizens to remember the dead of this conflagration, you know?
So that's one of the big questions I tried to answer then is, so what does this mean for, like, when we go fight in the Philippines, or more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan? What does that mean? And to be honest with you, I think if you asked Lincoln, I mean, in this case, my advisor, his point would come back that this is really just a speech for the moment. And I don't deny that. And I'm sure that Lincoln is thinking about that. How do I get through this war? It's going terrible. He's probably going to lose the next election, and I've got to rally the troops, and we can't win a single battle, it seems like. So I'm sure that Lincoln understood that as such. But, you know, when presidents speak, they do have meaning in the moment. And people, I think, take that seriously. You know, the Civil War shed the most amount of American blood in our history. And when we count not only the people who died, but you know, people who were wounded, who were disabled, who were missing, tens of thousands of people went missing. Um, um, there was probably not a single person in the United States at the time who was untouched. They knew directly or indirectly someone who had been in that conflict. And so I think that those words, maybe Lincoln probably is trying to navigate a moment, but because the moment is so big and because the cost is so high, I think it transcends into culture. And I'm not sure that it transcends into culture at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
He's not even the keynote speaker. He's
Right.
sort of the afterthought. But what it does is it does, particularly as the war ends, and particularly after Lincoln himself is assassinated, and everybody turns him into this mythological creature himself. I think those words transcend into culture after the fact. But yeah.
Right. And then those in power just kind of co-opted it afterwards for their own purposes.
Well, it's a great model, right? It's a great model. If you're the commander in chief and you're going to commit boys to die,
yeah,
you better justify that, because you got to get reelected, or you have some sort of accountability to the citizenry. And so Lincoln creates this model that that William McKinley and Woodrow Wilson and every president, interestingly enough, except for the most recent ex-president, Donald Trump, every president up until very current times has attempted to model and fulfill. They've had to twist and turn it and
sure.
make a square peg fit a round hole, so to speak. But they have followed that model. And so in that way, it's a great model for politicians.
Right. It has been used very politically for on both sides of the spectrum to make it palatable, whatever type of conflict we've been in as a country. No, that's fabulous. Thank you. What I wanted to kind of, I have some questions that they were in order. I might kind of mix them up a little bit.
Sure.
But one of the most fascinating parts of the book for me, I mean, it was all fascinating, but being a Civil War buff, right? We move from Lincoln's Promise, and then you really get into some meaty stuff here with how the North and South kind of created a reconciliation between each other at the expense of emancipation and the success of Reconstruction, which it wasn't a success, right? And it was almost as if the Lincoln's Promise was abandoned over the more economic issues, and just let's just get along because we're together again, North and South. Let's just get along. Let's, be conciliatory, over a sense of like new nationhood, which eventually moves into imperialism, right? So I just loved how you kind of you brought that together, but and you mentioned David Blight. You had some really, your bibliography was amazing, and your source materials fantastic. And I'm just kind of jumping around here, but you quoted David Blight as saying that it was, do you agree that it was a project of racism that made reunification possible? Just expanding on the topic of how Lincoln's promise of making all men free really took a back seat after he was assassinated. And then it was very sad to me to read it. It was hard to read, but it's like, yeah, we did not finish the job.
Yeah. No, we didn't. And we still haven't.
No,
we still haven't. And so, well, I think David Blight, of course, his book, I think Race and Reunion, is sort of like the book that sort of starts this conversation in American circles. I don't disagree with him. I think he's right. That race is part of the issue. But I guess I would add to that, his book really only focuses on race inside the United States. And I think what I would add on to that is that racism needs an environment in which to fester. And one way that racism festered is in this larger environment of empire. when we go to war in Cuba and then shortly thereafter the Philippines at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we have, and even before that on smaller sort of scales, but wars against Native American peoples in the West. These are moments when Northerners and Southerners who fought against each other are now shoulder to shoulder. And we have politicians like Teddy Roosevelt, who is trying to leverage war for his own political gain. And he wants to show how he can lead. He wants to show how he can lead Northerners and Southerners, white men and black men, effectively. And that's why you should vote for him. And so he's going to use these wars of empire, and many other politicians are going to do the same thing. And many people are going to buy into this project to try to bring Northerners and Southerners together in a way that minimizes civil rights, women's rights, various other sorts of groups who are being excluded from the American project. And they're going to use the empire, this imperialistic expansion, to justify that and to fulfill those goals. I think too, the environment that's festering is this, particularly in the 19th century, the United States is just such a cutthroat capitalist environment where we have these huge ups and huge depressions. And 1873 is the big depression. It's the biggest depression in American history up to that point. And when the depression hits and these radical Republicans who had been promoting social justice during Reconstruction are in power, when that happens, they get blamed for it. And then they get voted out. And then there's no one there to push the project along. And so we have to look at the voters as well. Why do voters sort of vote differently? And I think the third thing that goes into this is Alexis de Tocqueville, who I talked about earlier in the book. I think his observation is really important, that democracies tend to forget because we're always in a state of renewal and we're not a feudalistic sort of world. So we're always forgetting. So the sort of natural default or the natural tendency is for people to forget. I mean, some people are today actively trying to forget the insurrection on January 6th already, and we're just now barely into February, right? So there's always this sort of forgetting that takes place. So all those things, right? Empire, economic depression, this sort of forgetfulness, I think maybe goes some way to explaining why we failed to complete the project.
Right. And it's kind of ironic too, when Lincoln calls us to remember and we're really good at forgetting.
Well, I think I said with Lincoln too, I think I said that I use him to contradict this, right? Lincoln was, remember, de Tocqueville says, sorry, you guys aren't going to be able to do it. So who do we believe is an interesting question. What do we believe? Do we believe de Tocqueville or do we believe Lincoln? My heart wants to go with Lincoln.
Yeah.
Sometimes my head goes with de Tocqueville. So. Right.
Well, that leads wonderfully into my next question, because you're talking about memory. I mean, that is part of your subtitle, cultural memory. And I had never heard of this before. So you introduced, well, to me, it's an introduction. I had never heard of phrases such as hot and cold memory. And I was wondering if you could, speak to some of those terms so that anyone who's going to read the book is aware of like what those terms mean and the context for that.
Absolutely. Other more esteemed scholars in the 60s and 70s developed sort of these terms that I then sort of use.
Okay.
So these are not my ideas, but I try to apply them to U.S. history. But as straightforward as possible, hot memory. Memory is hot when the past is present in the present.
Okay.
That is to say, when the past seeps into the present, memory is hot. The Gettysburg Address and Reconstruction are examples of hot memory, where we acknowledge America's slave past, our role in slavery.
Okay.
And you could also say this about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's a hot memory.
Okay.
Because we're acknowledging the past, and we're trying to keep the past in the present to help us
see.
change.
We're
In
still
fact,
engaging with it.
yeah,
So, okay.
absolutely. We're engaging with it, actively engaging with it. Hot memory is interested in change, even revolution. It doesn't have to be revolution. It can be evolution, but change.
Mhm.
Cold memory is the opposite. Cold memory is where the past is absent in the present. So people try to insulate the present from the past. I try to use that word insulate a bit, or separate the present from the past. And this is the memory that is trying to prevent change, trying to keep things in the status quo, trying to keep things from revolution. So, for example, the lost cause is a perfect example of cold memory. It's a false memory. It's a past that never happened. The lost cause of past that never, ever, ever happened, but it's brought up as a way to keep the past from coming to the present. It's a way to deny slavery or to deny the past. And then it allows for people who advocate this cold memory to do things like pass Jim Crow laws or practice racism or these sorts of things. So that's how I try to distinguish between the two.
Okay.
And a cold memory would allow the United States to practice empire without acknowledging that they're imperialistic, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And that was one of the well, one of the overarching things I took away from your book is this, and you point to it in your epilogue, the inconsistencies of a nation that acts imperialistically while claiming to be Republican. And I was like, gosh, that sounds like a lot like Rome. Right? I mean, for citizens, it's a republic, right? Well, it was for a time. Okay, and then it moved full-fledged into, empire. Well, I guess, we're kind of going off on that track, but we're
you could say a very similar thing about the United States. America is a republic for some people. If historically, if you're white and you're male, you've always been in the republic. If you're not in those categories, you've been excluded. And the fight has been to use a hotter memory to get other people included in that republic. And so we've always had this tension of who gets to participate in democracy and who doesn't. And in that way, I would agree with you. We're kind of both at the same time, you could argue, in a weird way.
Right. And how long can a nation be in that tension? I mean, history tells us.
Well, Rome was pretty powerful for a long time,
but it eventually ended.
It ended.
So
I would argue that no country can be all powerful forever.
I agree with that. I absolutely agree.
Impossible. Yeah.
I mean, if you're true to your calling as a historian and your loyalty to, looking at the facts, studying the sources, and just seeing how things began, crested, concluded, I mean, you have to be very honest, and it can be very unsettling, but
yeah, it can be. And a lot of people don't like that because of the whole, a lot of Americans, I would argue that the idea of American exceptionalism, that we're unique and special, is a cold memory, or is a cooler, at least a cooler memory. And in popular culture, this is how Americans understand themselves. And it's a weak point, maybe, in that it doesn't allow you to acknowledge the past, and therefore it doesn't really allow you to adapt or respond to the present as well as perhaps we could or should.
Right. So, right. To course correct, on things that, are kind of darker marks on our report card as a country.
Although I would say, Peg, to maybe make it a little more uplifting note, in that, look at the Germans. How dark of a memory can you have in the Holocaust? And the Germans have, it's always a work in progress, but they have been able to be honest about their past. They have had a hot memory now for a few decades,
Mhm.
and they acknowledge and commemorate and feel a shame about their past, and they've been able to move on. So I guess I would say that it is completely possible to do that. The Germans show that it's possible. I'm not saying they're perfect,
Yeah.
or that they always have all the answers, but they do. This philosopher named Susan Neiman wrote this book. I think it's called What We Can Learn from the Germans, or something to that effect.
Oh, I was just thinking, I can
Yeah.
see the cover of the book right now. I've been
Yeah.
wanting to
Yeah.
read that.
It's a
Yeah.
beauty. I just finished reading it. It is fantastic. And
Really? Okay.
I love the
Getting it.
book. And she makes this case that we can learn a lot from them.
Okay.
And she even investigates a lot of places in the American South today where we have a hot memory. There's a hot memory going on. You know, if you go to Montgomery, Alabama, the Equal Justice Initiative has created a museum that commemorates lynching and tries to talk about how this history has led to this unfair incarceration rate for African American men, and it's right there in Montgomery,
Oh, I
Alabama,
see.
and people
Right.
go to it, and it's this powerful acknowledgement of the past. And
Mhm.
if you read the newspapers, or surf the web, you would never know that stuff like this go on, but there's a hot memory in America as we speak. So I guess
Okay.
it is. I do want to say that there's room for optimism. Um,
And it's right that you do that, that we kind of, there is hope. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there isn't. Obviously, we can change as a country. We've made great strides. I mean, all I can say is the longer I study history, I can't say that, I'm constantly, my mind is always being changed. I mean, which I hope that is the correct approach to history. I mean, if you just study history and your opinion never changes, or your viewpoint, I feel like you're studying it incorrectly,
well, there I would say there's another example of hot and cold sort of memory in a way. If you're learning and changing, you're allowing the past to influence your way of
yes.
thinking. And if you're
Yeah.
not learning or thinking, then you're just it's propaganda. Then you're just
Right.
you're not learning, and you're not allowing the past to influence the way that you think. That's a larger sort of point about history. People think history never changes, but that's a misunderstanding of history. It's moments don't change, they happen, but our interpretations change all the time. And therein lies what's fascinating to
Yes.
study
Mhm.
history, why it's so interesting.
I agree. There's always a dialogue going on between the past and the present.
Yeah.
If you choose to, and you want to engage with it, there's a conversation waiting to to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why I love history. It's just,
I think that's the larger question, is how can we get the public at large, particularly maybe people who have had a semester or two of history in high school,
Mhm.
or a semester or two of history in college. How can we get these people to engage with the past? That is, I think, the key to making our memory hotter, if you will.
Yes. Well, and by the books that you write, and then my little channel here, I'm hoping that we're changing, we're getting people more involved and keeping it hot.
That's right. It's a hot channel.
It's a hot channel.
Bookshelf is a hot channel.
That's how I should market it. Hot channel. Okay. Well, I wanted to also mention too that, fans of Drew Gilpin Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, will love Death at the Edges of Empire, because it continues. And I love that book. I read it when it first came out. It was many, many years ago, but this book kind of continues that type of exploration of, how as a culture we handle death, especially obviously military deaths, right? And how we commemorate them. But you take it from the Civil War and then move it outwards through wars that, like you were mentioning before, and I think you might have even told me, maybe it was you or someone else, that I think it was Max Boot's book, The Savage Wars of Peace or something like that. The smaller wars that we just don't hear about, but, like the Philippines and Cuba. And, and we're moving into my next question on the USS Maine, but I just wanted to mention that, you really expand on that in a very a very thoughtful way that I had never considered, like some of these things. I knew that, like, as we move into Cuba, and then, it's, some people think that the reason that we got into the war with Spain was a false, what do you want to call it? Not a false flag, but I guess it was, the USS Maine. How did that ship explode? Right. It's, and then, but you took it into a whole different area where it's like, you had the citizenry saying our soldiers, our seamen, our sailors are still in the hold of the ship, and it's in foreign waters. So what, as the government, are you going to do to remember what they did here? Right. We're going back to Lincoln's promise. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you could just, speak to that, because again, I just feel like you really opened up the whole lens of exploration. It was fantastic.
Well, Drew Gilpin-Faust's book is such a beautiful, lovely book. I have to admit, I was really upset when her book came out, because I was just almost to defend my dissertation when it came out. And then I read it and I had to rewrite the whole thing.
Oh, no.
But that was a good thing in the end, because her book was so powerful and beautiful. It's elegantly written and makes such a powerful point. And I would highly recommend this Republic of Suffering to anyone. Yeah. And it was a big influence on the way my work sort of evolved. And, the USS Maine, when it accidentally blew up from the coal dust probably on board in the hold, it stayed sunk in Havana Harbor for over a decade. And it was a problem because it blocked traffic.
Yeah.
In the harbor. But Cuba also are technically, they're independent, and you have this wreckage of a U.S. battleship, reminding all these Cubans that, we're actually trying to tell you what to do. And so eventually it came to where they had to build a dam around it, get all the water out, repair it, float it again, recover all the dead bodies that are on board, and then they floated it out to international waters, and then they resunk it again, maybe to hide the evidence of
right
what's going on. I don't know. We'll leave that up to everybody to choose for themselves. But that moment and moments of how to recover the war dead who fought in Cuba and the Philippines, that it begs this question, like, does Lincoln's promise apply to places beyond Gettysburg,
right,
and wars beyond the boundaries of the United States? And I argue that maybe Lincoln probably didn't intend it to, but people like McKinley and Roosevelt, presidents during this time, are going to take that Lincolnian tradition, right? That sort of ritual and tradition that Lincoln began, and they're going to kind of flip it on its head. And they're going to stress this idea, it's a war for democracy, for Cuban democracy. And it also brought Northerners and Southerners who fought against each other in the Civil War together.
Yeah.
So these sorts of arguments and ideas are going to get sort of turned on their head to sort of say, this is a noble cause war, and we need to honor and commemorate these soldiers. It's very interesting because Cuba, 1898, that's only 100 and maybe 20 years when the Revolutionary War happened, right? So how do you explain this? Just a century before, we fought against the empire, and now we kind of are the empire.
Yeah.
You justify that. And I think the Lincoln's promise being turned on its head does that. And interestingly enough, when you do that, it then allows Confederates to say, oh, what about us? Hey, what about us?
Right.
Particularly if you begin to deny, you say, well, we weren't fighting over slavery, We were fighting for states' rights. It was a noble cause. Well, then all of a sudden, now all these Confederate soldiers who had been excluded from Lincoln's promise, they now get included in it.
It's fascinating.
And after the fact. Yeah.
It's almost as if like the imperialism, or the early American imperialism, was used as a salve, for the Civil War. It's like,
yes.
Yeah, you feel these ripples from the Civil War. I mean, it's just hitting me now. It's just like, okay, so we started doing these imperialistic ventures, but in a way, it served a purpose to bind together people who were previously only within a generation had been slaughtering each other on American farms, on fields and stuff. So
yeah, absolutely.
wow.
I love the word salve. That's exactly what it is, a salve or a balm or something like that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, it's not a balm for African-American people.
Of course, yes. People, no,
right? This is still a wound that is festering. But for white Northerners and white Southerners, that's exactly what it is. I think that the empire becomes a balm for reunification without any accountability. And that kind of goes back to your question, why we failed with.
Why we didn't finish the work of Lincoln's promise.
Yeah.
And we're still working.
Yeah.
I hope we are working towards it. Or at least half the country is. I'm making a broad generalization. Gosh, that it just, as I interview people, I get like, sometimes I get like a light bulb above my head. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
It kind of comes together even more. Wow. Well, and how, as you keep as your focus, the war dead and how we commemorate them, but you really kind of you talk on these broader themes too. So I know we're not strictly talking about how we bury the war dead or do these rituals. You really expand out and talking about imperialism. Your section on you're just talking about the lost cause and how North and South tried to come together through these imperialistic endeavors. Well, then we get to really taking it overseas with World War I, right? And President Woodrow Wilson. And I like how you say in your book, Lincoln's long shadow fell over Wilson. Can you expand on that? Like, how do you think Wilson? What do you think he was thinking and feeling at this time?
Well, Wilson says famously that his first ever memory as a child, because I think he's from Virginia or something.
Yeah, he's a Southerner.
Yeah. Right. His first ever memory was the announcement that the Union won the Civil War. I think if that's the idea. And he felt a sort of, shame about that sort of a thing. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story he likes to tell. I think that shows him he's the first Southern president of the United States since before Lincoln, right?
Right.
We have a lot of Southern presidents up until Lincoln, and then we don't have another Southern president until Woodrow Wilson, and he's only the second Democrat since Woodrow Wilson, since Abraham Lincoln. Everybody else, everybody else had been Republican, right? Mm-hmm. So he is. Really kind of the antithesis in some ways on the surface of Lincoln. But when the First World War ends, Wilson is a progressive who is trying to bring a sort of world cooperation through the League of Nations. And he loves the idea of a League of Nations and his 14-point plan, which would create free trade, which would do many things. Britain and France, they don't like it so much. And so he's got this tension. And so when he's negotiating the Peace of Paris conference to end World War I, he goes over to France, first president ever to leave US soil while president. Grant had toured the world after he was, but while he was president, I think, and he goes over there and he's there on Memorial Day in 1919, and his negotiations are going terrible. Every point he brings up of his 14-point plan to make part of the post-war process, they keep voting it down. He's just, so he uses Memorial Day to try to jumpstart the League of Nations. And he goes to a new American military cemetery in Suresnes, France, literally in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It's a beautiful cemetery. If you ever get the chance to go there, it's really beautiful. But he's there and he gives this, I think it's a strange speech in hindsight. He's speaking about how the world needs to adopt the League of Nations, but he keeps bringing up the Civil War. He keeps bringing up this idea of Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers, and they fought against each other, and then they had peace. And can you imagine if you were like a French person or a British person and you listen to the speech, you're like, what
the heck?
Yeah, what does that got to do with it? But he keeps doing this, and he never really quotes Lincoln explicitly from the Gettysburg Address, but he does say, just as these Confederate soldiers and these Union soldiers died for the nation, so our World War I soldiers died for democracy and Western civilization. And, you know, just as these Confederate soldiers and these Union soldiers died to keep the nation together, so these World War I soldiers died to create a new sort of world organization.
To create my League of Nations.
Exactly.
In other words, Woodrow.
Exactly. And of course, that plays really well in America, because culturally, everybody understands exactly what he's talking about. But David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, or Georges Clemenceau, the Premier of France, and all these French people, they're just like, what are you talking about?
That falls flat with them.
Yeah.
I mean, their history is different. Their form of government is different. They don't have that shared history.
Yeah.
They don't have those hot memories, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So it falls flat, as you say. And I think, although eventually the League of Nations does, they do approve it, they reject all the other points of the 14-point plan. And I don't think it really creates a very effective memory. And then I argue in the book, that's why we had to create the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier has to then fix this void in transatlantic memory. Because, you know, the French and the British, they have their Poilu Inconnu and the unknown warrior first, and then we have our unknown soldier. And so now that speaks to Europeans in a transatlantic way that kind of makes sense culturally. And
so we're kind of bound together in that type of cultural memory. Is it called the cenotaph in Britain? Is it the cenotaph?
It's the monument that has no body in it.
Right. And you know, you see them doing their yearly or their commemorations. You know.
But they also have the unknown warrior is in the Westminster Abbey.
Okay.
So there's two.
There's
sites.
two that they have. Okay. So in a way, it's almost like more white men bonding, right? Well, you know what I mean.
Well,
I mean,
absolutely. No, that's absolutely to the point.
Yeah,
that's absolutely to the point, because, you know, in none of this are there any like ideas about how we're going to incorporate Vietnam into this community, or people from India, or Native Americans, or even African Americans inside the US. No, this is a time of segregation. So it is very white male driven. And I do think that Wilson is trying to copy Lincoln in this idea. And I think he shows how he fails. I think he gives us an example of how this attempt to model Lincoln's promise falls flat on its face. It just doesn't work outside the United States.
It doesn't.
In that pure form.
Right. It's fascinating. So do you think, as a, you know, I know we have a little bit of time left here. I want to make sure we cover all points, but you've got a lot of great stuff in this book. I was saying in my review that it's definitely something I'm going to reread alongside other books, looking at those times. But how could, in that time and space, in this time period, how could we have, and this is taking it off script a little bit, but how could we, as a country, recognize the contributions of the others who were left out? Was it just impossible based on the narrative we had created for ourselves, like North and South? We were like brothers having a punching match, then we shook hands, and now we're side by side and we're stronger than ever. And in the meantime, the reason why we fought the war, which was to end slavery and all this, the African-American people, their progress, their rights were just continue to be trampled on. And, as far as commemorating, we did have, African-American soldiers who fought in the Civil War, who did go, I think they did go overseas they were in the Philippines. Weren't there some on the Rough Riders, I think?
Yeah, the Rough Riders are.
They had a
Cuba.
Contingent in Cuba, and then also in World War I, you did have, soldiers of color and of different races. So
yeah, so the Rough Riders specifically talk about Teddy Roosevelt's group, but they also they call them at the time, the nomenclature is the USCT, the United States Colored Troops.
Okay, right.
They have white officers in charge.
White officers, yeah.
They're all Black units. And they fought, actually, African Americans have fought in every single war from before the Revolution all the way up to today. And I think maybe to sort of answer this question, what could we have done differently? One thing that I might put forth, and I'm not criticizing the commemoration of the war dead, but let's say that maybe we need at least some sort of equal commemoration of slaves. I think there's a mistake in valorizing the war dead into a cult at the expense of slaves. Why don't we acknowledge the runaway slaves or slaves who died on the plantation? Are they not heroes? And I think they are, in the sense that particularly those who died in slavery or who maybe died trying to run away, they're the ones who are bringing down the institution of slavery just as much as the maybe white warriors are, in a sense, right? And so I think that's one small way that we could acknowledge these and I think that's why the museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that tries to commemorate lynch victims, many of which victims we don't even have records of them, right? But I think this is something that's really important, is that we need to recognize culturally. We need to have a hotter memory of the sacrifices that maybe they're not in the military officially, but they are playing a key role in undermining these oppressive institutions. We should also look to people on Native American reservations that perhaps, or even before the reservation system is in place, that are challenging American empire. When we get to the point where we can acknowledge this sort of anti-imperialistic sort of idea, I think then we'll have the ability to think more broadly about memory, commemoration, and fulfilling some of these unfinished projects. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I really feel, Shannon, that the conversations like we're having and the conversations that come about from books like yours is, I feel like we're living through history right now, where we're feeling it. We're feeling we finally hit the wall where we can't go any further with some of these contradictions, that tension that you were talking about. But in this case, with, looking at the past and needing to recognize those who we've kind of just left in the dust or trampled on, and you're right. I think these conversations will decide our future in a sense, because you're seeing a lot of people kind of revolt against the idea of, hey, not everything America did in the past was great or exceptional. We still have great and exceptional ideals that, we were founded on. And it's a work in progress, but we have to admit where we failed, and try to make it right and move forward. So just as you were talking, I'm like, wow, I mean, just look at what happened at the Capitol. I mean, that is unheard of. And we lived through this, and people are already trying to forget it. And it's like, no, we're seeing an actual visceral reaction to what you're saying, and proposing, to what I believe in my heart to be true, that, there are people who have not been part of the American, ideal, the dream, who have been struggling to be part of it, but haven't been. And so when you're hearing people push back on the side of more commemoration of African Americans and the slaves and Native Americans and what was done, they need to be heard. And the reaction that we're seeing, the pushback we're seeing from the opposite side, it's like, do you see it as like a second uncivil war, as President Biden said in his inaugural speech? I mean, I really feel like we're living through a very pivotal point in our history as a nation. That's my personal view.
What I love about history is it does, I think, help contextualize the present. And I completely agree with you. Yeah, we're living in we have been living in a very sort of historical moment for some time now, where history is unfolding in front of us.
Yeah.
And some people take a lot of negativity from that, and I understand why. But I also, being a student of history, things could be worse. In fact, things were worse in the past, and yet progress was made, and maybe not perfectly, but people came through the fire, so to speak, and things have gotten better over time. Nowhere near perfect by any means. And that gives me hope. I think that gives me hope for the here and now, that I kind of feel that people are learning about the past, as much as I see people who maybe storm the Capitol or maybe believe in conspiracy theories, as much as they kind of are loud. I also, at the same time, I see all of these other sorts of conversations that are going on, and ideas that are going on, that actually people are learning from the past. It seems like people are thinking seriously about the fact that certain groups of people have been excluded from the American system for a long time. And maybe it's time we have an honest conversation about that. There are certain things that I never thought I would see that are happening now. Like some people, I mean, it's kind of died down now, but earlier in the last political cycle, people were having a robust conversation about reparations. We've had reparations for Japanese internment victims, so it's not unprecedented. And in Susan Neiman's book that I referenced earlier, she talks about how the German taxpayer paid reparations to Israel in an incredible amount of money as reparations for the Holocaust, right? So I never thought we'd have a serious conversation, and we could have more of that, but it was initiated. Can you imagine the General Lee Monument coming down in Richmond, Virginia? Like, it's not down yet, but I mean, I never thought that would ever be on the table, right? And
yes,
and so there's a lot of things. If you kind of have to look hard, but there's a lot of things around that shows that it is a moment to be very concerned about, and it's kind of worrying, but it's also uplifting, I think, and very positive and hopeful. And I kind of like to look at those things too.
Absolutely. And I think that is a wonderful place to kind of, to end our discussion on, is that I'll just say, as a personal note, that, I was a Civil War reader when I was a little girl, and I actually lived in Milledgeville, Georgia at one point, which Sherman marched through. But I remember visiting the old Capitol the little Capitol building there, and going to the library and getting all these books on the Civil War. But I was from Michigan, so it's like, I was a Yankee in the South as a young girl, and I never understood, I would say to my mom, why is there a statue up of, why is there a Confederate flag? They lost. Even as a young child, I had that common sense that somehow, it took years and decades of study to realize it was a nefarious rewriting of history by a cadre of ex-Confederates who wanted to rewrite history, make themselves justify their actions, make Lee into a god man, and to see now, like the Lee statue might as well come down because it's just completely covered in graffiti and colorful graffiti. And it's just, to me, that is, I know there's a lot of people in the South that consider that anathema, but to me, that's a sign of hope because I never understood. We should, to me, Lee was a traitor and Jefferson Davis. I mean, these were two high profile guys I thought should have been brought to some type of justice in the country, and they weren't. And I think that's another reason why we weren't really able to finish the work of the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, I guess, cultural kin because I'm from Michigan originally as well.
Hey, what parts?
Just a small, tiny town called White Pigeon, Michigan.
White Pigeon. Oh, wait, what part of Michigan? Do the hand.
So Detroit is over here.
Right here.
Kalamazoo is over here.
Yeah.
Right on the border with Indiana.
No kidding.
I live. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was just right outside Detroit in Livonia.
Yeah. Oh, my aunt lived in Livonia for I don't know, 10 years. Yeah.
Great little town.
Yeah. And then I moved to Georgia. I'm here in Alpharetta, a suburb of.
Yay, we've got a lot common, Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with you. This is it's a strange cultural sort of thing to think about. I guess now recently, and only in the last couple of months, I've really kind of considered myself to be more from Georgia now. I've lived longer in Georgia than I have in Michigan. And so I think about it a little bit differently now. And I think you're exactly right that the South is so much more than just this 4-year period of the Confederacy. And these people who led the Confederacy or the South through the Confederacy to absolute economic ruin. Yeah. Why do we honor these people? They should not be part of Lincoln's promise.
They should not.
They should be excluded. And I think more and more people are having that conversation. I think young people, I see it in my classes every day, people are having more and more this conversation, and it's slowly but surely becoming, important. And then hopefully we can take this conversation of memory and then activate it into politics and socioeconomic reality to where we can finish this radical Reconstruction project that was begun in the 1860s and continue the dream of racial equality. That's I think something that we can do if we can just get the past into the present. I think we can start with that.
We need to keep the memories hot, folks.
Yeah.
You need to have a hot memory.
It's hard to do. Yeah. I see memory warming up right now, so that's good.
Yes. It is good. And I think that is a wonderful note to end on, is just like, we're doing the work. We'll continue to do the work. We'll keep the memories hot. But your book definitely keeps that conversation going. It engages. And I just can't recommend this book highly enough. So I'm just going to put it out there again. Shannon, that your book, Death at the Edges of Empire, is put out by University of Nebraska Press, but I'm sure it's on Amazon and anywhere they sell books. Yeah,
it is. And I don't know if I should exactly say this, but in the fall, it's going to get a paperback edition.
Outstanding.
So I'm excited about that. And don't tell anybody except your listeners.
Okay,
so
I won't.
It's a little expensive at the moment in the cloth, but it'll be more inexpensive sometime in the fall of this year. Is supposed to be a paperback. So
well, I'll tell you what. When it comes out on paperback, I'm going to get a copy and I'll show it again on the channel. So
Thanks,
because
I appreciate that.
Well, I think it really adds to the conversation of moving forward, the note of hope that you're talking about, and having these crucial conversations, whether in classrooms or work, without neighbors, whatever. I mean, just families, because, these times we live in are really divisive. Even families are divided over these issues that are very hot, these memories. I love that now, cold and hot. But this was just a great book, Shannon. Thank you so much for coming on. If there's anything else you want to add, please feel free. But it was great having you on. And I hope, I know what I wanted to ask you. Yes, it's my favorite question. What are you working on next? Because, I have to get my hands on that when it comes out.
Well, thanks. Yeah, no, I am working on a project.
Okay.
It is a sort of volume 2 of Death of the Edges of the Empire. I'm on a fellowship right now to translate. I was able to go to France a few years ago now and get all these French language archives, French language documents from the French archives about World War I cemeteries in France. The United States government paid, taxpayer dollars paid for mothers and widows to go to France, all expenses paid trip for 6 weeks to go visit the grave of their lost,
Wow.
their lost loved one. It's called the Gold Star Pilgrimages. The American Legion went to France in 1927 on a huge pilgrimage to visit all of these cemeteries of World War I dead. And then when the Second World War came, the United States, who were operating these cemeteries, they had to vacate. They had to abandon them. They actually had to leave them in the hands of French people.
Wow.
As the Nazis rolled in. And had it not been for these French superintendents and caretakers and translators, and they called them secretaries at the time, but all of these French people who stayed in Nazi-occupied France and looked after these cemeteries on behalf of the United States, these cemeteries, may not have survived. And so I'm looking at this, I'm calling it, at the moment, it's called The Affinity of War Traveling Memory. So the idea that memory travels.
Okay.
Traveling memory, fallen soldiers and the American Empire in France is what I'm looking at.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm gonna be one of your first readers. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, thanks. It might be a couple years before
sure.
it comes out, but I'm working on it. I started the introduction. I'm writing the introduction as we speak.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, please, let me know how your things are going. Please keep in touch for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
This was so much fun. I really learned a lot. Shannon, thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Peg. It was great. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're more than welcome. So yeah, so I'll end up on this note. I'll just say BookTube again, Death at the Edges of Empire. You're not supposed to know about the paperback coming, but I'll show it again when it comes out. But it's just a fabulous read, and please check it out. So until next time, BookTube, see you later. Bye.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.